If you just picked up Space Marine 2 and you're wondering why warriors seem to be everywhere even though the lore calls them rare, why that Lictor keeps ripping you apart from the shadows, or what that floating brain thing actually is, this is your video. Space Marine 2 is a sampler platter. The actual Tyranid swarm is the full buffet from hell, and by the end of this video, you'll understand both what you fought and what the game mercifully chose not to throw at you. The first things the game sends at you are Termagants and Hormagaunts. The Termagant is four-armed, about knee-height to a Space Marine, and it carries a Fleshborer, a living organism that functions as a ranged weapon by launching armored beetles at sufficient velocity to penetrate flesh and continue burrowing once they've entered a target. The Lexicanum documents the Fleshborer as a separate organism in a symbiotic relationship with the Termagant that carries it. In SM2, you'll kill Termagants by the 100, and they die fast enough that you probably didn't register you were being shot at by a creature carrying another creature as its firearm. The Hormagant dispenses with ranged options entirely. 2 pairs of slashing limbs, a low center of gravity, and a charge velocity engineered specifically to close the distance before ranged weapons can stop them. In the game's wave encounters, they form the rushing mass that occupies your immediate melee attention while something considerably worse gets into position behind you. Lore-wise, the Lexicanum describes them as fearsome but expendable, the clinical language the Codex uses for creatures the hive mind considers interchangeable losses, organisms deployed in sufficient numbers that the math doesn't require them to survive individually. Both bioforms exist in their billions. The Codex uses Hormagaunts and Termagants as the literal mass of a Tyranid ground assault. They are the ocean, and every other bioform in this game is either riding that ocean, directing it, or emerging from beneath it. Keep that ratio in mind. Personality hook for Termagants. They have a living gun. The gun is also trying to eat you. In the Tyranid swarm, weapon and organism aren't different categories. Everything is both, simultaneously, and the Fleshborer beetle continues hunting if the Termagant carrying it stops moving. Tyranid Warriors are everywhere in SM2. Mid-mission, late mission, throughout operations, appearing as the standard elite enemy type in waves that would constitute a significant military crisis in any other game. They stand roughly 3 meters tall. Some Codex-adjacent accounts cite closer to twice a man's height, which at standard human scale approaches the 3.5-meter range. Multi-limbed, insectoid, fast enough that their size is surprising the first time one closes distance. They carry variable loadouts, close combat variants with scything talons, ranged variants with biocannons, mixed configurations depending on what tactical role the swarm needs filled. Over 212 distinct observed variants of the warrior strain have been cataloged. Adaptive configurations for assault, ranged fire, infiltration, aerial deployment, and interdiction support. Some variants serve as heavier bodyguards. The apex version, the Tyranid Prime, is considered the pinnacle of the strain, a field commander upgrade representing the hive mind's maximum investment in the warrior bioform. Warriors aren't the infantry, they are the officer corps. The Codex describes them as synaptic foot troops, psychic relay nodes that transmit the hive mind's will to the gaunt masses around them. Kill a warrior, and the Termagants and Hormagaunts in its proximity don't just become leaderless in the conventional military sense. They lose their connection to the hive mind entirely. Hormagaunts that were coordinating a flanking maneuver become disoriented or feral. Termagants that were covering a position start firing randomly or stop moving altogether. The nervous system of that section of the swarm severs, and the muscle loses function. Lore documentation is consistent on this. Killing a Tyranid warrior causes nearby lesser Tyranids to die or collapse from severed synapse connection. This is the mechanism that makes warriors structurally load-bearing rather than simply powerful. One documented swarm composition lists warriors as significantly fewer in number than even a single patrol of 28 Termagants. That ratio matters. Each warrior is responsible for the coherent function of a brood of lesser organisms. When the hive mind deploys a warrior, It's deploying a nervous system relay responsible for coordinating potentially hundreds of gaunts. Fewer relay nodes are needed because each one does so much work, and losing one cascades through an entire sector of the swarm's tactical response. The breadth of over 212 warrior variants tells you exactly what the hive mind thinks of the design. This isn't a grunt template iterated for convenience. This is the swarm's most versatile commissioned officer, adaptive enough to serve in aerial heavy infantry roles, infiltration specialist functions, ranged interdiction platforms, and direct assault simultaneously. Whatever tactical problem needs solving in a given engagement, there's a warrior configuration for it. Space Marine 2 threw you the officer corps, constantly, throughout the entire campaign and operations mode. The game frames them as elite enemies, which is accurate, but elite in SM2 terms means appears frequently and takes multiple hits. Elite in the lore means the most important non-character creature on the battlefield, the loss of which cascades to collapse an entire sector of the swarm's nervous system. You weren't fighting standard enemies. You were systematically decapitating command structures, and the game just forgot to tell you what that meant at scale. Personality hook. Warriors are hate, made manifest in a 3-meter synaptic kill machine. SM2 deployed approximately 900 of them at you as if they were common issue. They were the command structure. You were extraordinarily effective. In SM2, the Lictor is classified at extremist threat level, the game's highest enemy tier. It serves as the first major boss encounter in the campaign during a mission called Severance. Mid-fight, it turns invisible. It's fast, it comes from unexpected angles, and the execution sequence at the end has you finish it in a QuickTime event, both hands around something that was, seconds earlier, impossible to see. That sequence feels earned. Here is what the Lictor actually is in the full lore, and why surviving one is something closer to a miracle than a completed mission objective. The Lictor's species classification is Tyrannicus cameleo. Imperial troops who have encountered Lictors and survived long enough to name things call them the Spook or the Mantis Stalker. Those informal designations map the psychological response accurately. You name things like ghosts when you can't process them as soldiers. Lictors don't move with the swarm. They arrive before it. They are vanguard organisms in the strictest deployment sense, sent ahead of the hive fleet, sometimes weeks or months ahead, to infiltrate target worlds alone. The Lexicanum describes their chameleonic skin as rendering them all but invisible, a biological system that continuously matches any environment in active adaptation. Moving through dense terrain quickly and without sound isn't a capacity they develop, it's their primary designed function. You wouldn't hear a Lictor approach, you wouldn't see it until it decided to be seen, and by the time it made that decision, it would have already established the geometrically optimal position for what came next. Warhammer Community's official description of the Lictor states directly that its 2 crescent talons can effortlessly split a Space Marine in 2. The benchmark in that description isn't infantry or civilian infrastructure. It's a Space Marine, a human fighter in Astartes pattern power armor capable of stopping bolter rounds with their body. And the word the official text uses is effortlessly. The talons are the first capability the lore mentions. They aren't the most unsettling one. The feeder tendrils are. A Lictor doesn't just kill targets, it processes them. Feeder tendrils extract information by accessing cerebral matter, drilling through whatever armor or bone stands between the Lictor and the brain and reading what's inside. Lore references document the mechanism in specific terms. Lictors punch through Space Marine helmets with their mandibles to access the cerebral matter inside. Every soldier a Lictor kills becomes an intelligence upload. Tactical positions, defensive patterns, command decision tendencies, the specific locations of armored emplacements, the personal behavioral signatures of whoever is running the defense. All of that transmits back through the hive mind's psychic network. The kill is a secondary product. The primary product is data. Every Space Marine who died to a Lictor in your campaign contributed to the swarm's evolving model of how Space Marines fight. The Lictor doesn't hunt for food or territory. It hunts for tactical advantage, and dying to it's also a form of contributing to the enemy's war effort. The pheromone trails amplify this further. Lictors release biological markers that signal the strategic value of locations to the swarm following behind them. Command posts, ammunition stores, and defensive choke points receive stronger signals, making those positions more irresistible to the following horde. The Imperium has, at documented points, attempted to replicate these pheromone trails to misdirect Tyranid forces. That countermeasure exists in Imperial military history, which tells you two things simultaneously. The trail system is operationally significant, and Imperial science has been studying it long enough to attempt countermeasures. Neither fact is comforting. The Hive fleet in Space Marine 2 is Leviathan. Among the Lictor variants Leviathan created is Deathleaper, a unique individual with its own documented campaign history, deployed against a specific planetary governor to collapse the world's command structure through targeted assassination. Deathleaper didn't simply kill soldiers. It killed the soldiers the governor trusted, repeatedly, in escalating proximity to the governor himself, until the psychological effect became as operationally valuable as the physical one. Deathleaper earned its own named entry in the lore as Leviathan's personal instrument of targeted terror. The Lictors in SM2 came from the same fleet that produced Deathleaper. You executed one in a QuickTime event. The Lictor already sent the pheromone trail. Personality hook. The Lictor arrived before the fleet. It learned the terrain, killed the scouts, read their brains through their helmets, and marked your position on a map the swarm is still consulting. Killing it was heroic. It wasn't the reason the Lictor was deployed there. The floating brain bug. That's what the SM2 community named it, and the description is structurally accurate. It floats, its cranium dominates its silhouette, and when those eyes illuminate, something psychic and damaging is incoming. In SM2, Zoanthropes serve as mid-range psychic artillery, firing warp energy bolts from elevated positions while ground-level threats occupy your direct attention. The developers nerfed them in operations mode post-launch, after player feedback indicated the spawn rate was creating frustrating encounters. The unnerfed version was arguably closer to what the lore describes. Zoanthropes have atrophied bodies. The Lexicanum entry is precise. Atrophied bodies and limbs supporting bloated craniums. Limbs and thorax are so severely underdeveloped as to be near non-functional. The cranium is the opposite, massively overdeveloped, the product of the hive mind redirecting every available biological resource allocation away from locomotion and towards psychic capacity, the trade-off repeated in each developmental cycle until there was almost no body left to support the skull. Every vestigial limb still attached to a zoanthrope is material that could have been another centimeter of cranial mass, but wasn't. They can't walk. Zoanthropes possess no functional physical locomotion whatsoever. Movement across a battlefield happens entirely through psychic levitation. The enemy that felt frustrating in operations mode is a creature that surrendered ambulatory function to become a living aperture for warp energy discharge. What comes out of that cranium is the warp blast, a directed discharge of warp energy, described in Codex flavor text as the zoanthrope tapping into the raw power of the hive mind and unleashing it as a blast of pure warp energy that arcs from its oversized cranium. This isn't a biological projectile or a chemical weapon. It's reality bending in the direction of whatever the zoanthrope is targeting, a momentary channeling of the dimension that operates parallel to physical space, interacting with physical matter in ways that physical matter can't adequately counter. The Psychic Scream is the second ability, and the one SM2 represents most conservatively. In lore, the Psychic Scream is a silent pulse, silent externally, that registers in the mind of every sentient creature within a 20-meter radius as a crippling shriek. Necrons are immune, being soulless constructs with no psychic signature. Demons are immune, being entities of pure psychic substance. Humans and space marines receive the full effect. The game gives you a stagger, The lore describes a targeted assault on the brain's capacity to process sensory information, delivered at 20-meter radius simultaneously. Multiple lore sources point toward evidence that later zoanthrope variants incorporated Eldari genetic material. The swarm encountered one of the most psychically potent species in the galaxy, absorbed biological samples from that species, and the hive mind incorporated that data into the zoanthrope strain. The floating brain bug shooting at you in operations may have been running on stolen Eldari biology at the cellular level. The neurothrope, the bigger floating brain bug, leads zoanthrope broods as a distinct synapse character unit, separated into its own entry in 8th edition. Where standard zoanthropes serve as the psychic weapons battery, the neurothrope functions as the brood's psychic field commander, maintaining synapse while the zoanthropes fire. The community named the hierarchy accurately on instinct. To understand the ceiling of what a zoanthrope strain can become, there is a named variant called the Doom of Malantai, a specially adapted zoanthrope that evolved its psychic capability to directly consume the psychic energy and souls of an Eldari craft world. It fed on the psychic emanations of a craft world's worth of dying Eldari minds. It's named for the craft world it destroyed. The standard zoanthropes in SM2 are the baseline model. The Doom of Malantai is what the baseline produces when given sufficient time and sufficient prey. Personality hook. The floating brain bug traded the ability to walk in exchange for becoming a living aperture to warp energy. Your ranged weapon, by comparison, is a considerably more balanced life decision. This is a correction. In the previous video, the pronunciation was wrong. The word ravener derives from the same etymological root as ravenous, Middle English ravenor, meaning one that ravens, that plunders, that devours. The Oxford English Dictionary and Merriam-Webster both give the pronunciation as rhyming with ravenous. Ravener, emphasis on the first syllable. The name tells you exactly what the creature does in English, and now you have the pronunciation to match. To everyone in the comments who caught that, accurate. Moving on. In SM2, raveners come up from underground. The dirt displacement around the emergence point is the visual tell. The ground disturbs before the creature surfaces. Players have documented the audio signature as well, a subsurface disturbance sound that precedes the breach. They hit fast on the surface and withdraw underground before the engagement fully registers. Community feedback describes Lictor and Ravener ambushes collectively as the highest frustration encounters in the game, for the same structural reason. Both enemies leverage concealment you can't counter with positioning. The lore explains the full mechanism. Raveners are classified as a variant of the warrior bioform, a serpentine adaptation that replaced the standard bipedal frame with a sinuous tail built for rapid substrate burrowing. The official GW datasheet describes them as especially vicious and predatory warrior organisms used as shock troops by the hive mind. The Kill Team introduction characterizes the Ravener as a purpose-built, utterly lethal ambush predator made of nightmarish claws and blades. The documented tactical pattern in lore analysis is surface, attack, withdraw, surface elsewhere. A hit-and-disappear assault doctrine that makes static defensive positioning largely ineffective because the threat vector changes with each emergence. The distinction between Raveners and Lictors in Swarm doctrine is meaningful and deliberate. Lictors are solo precision instruments, one organism, deployed alone, optimized for stealth and targeted assassination of specific high-value individuals before the swarm arrives. Raveners are pack hunters operating in broods, deployed during the active assault phase, and their role isn't targeted assassination, but formation disruption. The Lictor is a scalpel applied to command structures. Raveners are a coordinated impact delivered from below. They punch through a defensive formation, force scatter, and vanish underground before the formation can consolidate response. The underground network they use isn't incidental to the tactic. It's the entire platform the tactic requires. A named Ravener exists in the lore, the Red Terror, documented during Hive Fleet Kraken's invasion as a notably oversized specimen within the strain. The Tyranid swarm produces almost no named individuals. Most bioforms are interchangeable expressions of the hive mind's iterative design process, identical within a strain. The Red Terror earned a distinct name in the record, which in the context of a faction where individuality is essentially absent, means the creature's performance warranted separate documentation in Imperial records. Personality hook. It's called a ravener because it ravens. It came up from under your feet, removed part of your squad, and was underground again before the sentence ended. The name is a job description. The job runs on schedule. Someone in the comment section of the original video called Ripper's friend-shaped. That comment earned over 1,000 likes. The community is onto something. Rippers are small, maggot-shaped, or eel-shaped depending on which edition's artwork is being referenced. Simple teeth, simple design, and in SM2 they appear as environmental detail, present around the aftermath of larger encounters, scuttling through spaces that have already been contested. They read as atmospheric texture, background organisms doing something that isn't directly relevant to you. The lore explains what they're doing. Rippers are the most numerous Tyranid bioform. The gaunt masses that overwhelmed you in wave after wave exist in their billions. Rippers exist in numbers beyond that, deployed in the final phases of a planetary consumption cycle after larger bioforms have broken organized resistance. Once warriors, Carnifexes, Lictors, and everything else you fought have neutralized the capacity for organized defense, Rippers cover every remaining surface. They swarm through oceans in vast masses, consuming all native sea life down to microbial scale. They burrow into crustal layers. Each Ripper consumes organic matter, processes it, and contributes the resulting biomass to digestion pools maintained by the hive fleet in orbit. When individual Rippers exhaust their accessible biomass and die, other Rippers consume them, because their own corpses are resource and no energy gets wasted in a system designed around total extraction. The Tyranid dead from the campaign itself, the warriors you killed, the Carnifexes that went down to fire support, the Zoanthropes that stopped levitating, all of that becomes biomass in the same pool. The swarm recycles its own losses before the fleet translates out. After a full consumption cycle, the planet is a rock. No topsoil, no ocean, no organisms at any scale. One documented witness account of a Tyranid invasion's early hours describes the surface covered by a flood of living blades and needle-fanged creatures. The Rippers are the final and most thorough layer of that flood, the process that ensures not even a fungus survives to restart the biosphere. Friend-shaped. They will eat your planet and leave a rock. Before the deep cuts, there's a terminology error from the previous video that needs a direct correction. A Broodlord and a Patriarch aren't the same creature. They share an origin in the gene-stealer bioform and have sufficient visual similarity to generate confusion, but they occupy completely different roles in the lore and in the faction's structure. A Broodlord is a combat-specialized gene-stealer variant that leads a brood in direct battle, directly under hive mind control. It was designated as a combat leader, integrated into the synaptic network, built for the active assault phase of an invasion. A Broodlord is the creature you'd encounter alongside other Tyranid forces in an open engagement. A Patriarch is what a gene-stealer becomes after decades, sometimes multiple generations, of surviving on an infiltrated world. The Patriarch was the original infector, the first gene-stealer to bite the first victim and begin building a gene-stealer cult from the resulting hybrid population. Over those decades, it has grown larger, mutated significantly beyond the standard gene-stealer form, developed considerable psychic power, and embedded itself as the psychic hub of a cult that may include thousands of hybrid individuals across multiple generations who don't fully understand what they carry in their biology. Critically, the Patriarch operates semi-independently of the hive mind's direct synapse control. It runs an insurgency from inside the target world, binding its hybrid children through psychic compulsion, waiting for the fleet to arrive within range. By the time the hive fleet reaches orbit, the Patriarch's cult has typically been operational for years, sabotaging infrastructure, placing hybrid operatives in positions of civic authority, assassinating command figures who might recognize the warning signs. The invasion doesn't need to land an army against a fully operational defense because the Patriarch has been dismantling that defense from the inside. The Patriarch is the years-long groundwork. The Broodlord is the battle plan. If you encountered one in SM2's campaign, that's a Broodlord, a combat leader plugged directly into the hive mind, built for the active engagement. The Patriarch is the thing that was already on the planet before the first Imperial officer suspected the swarm was anywhere within the system. Now for the things Space Marine 2 decided not to include. The standard Carnifex features in SM2 as the heavy encounter tier, a hulking organism the lore describes as a living battering ram, carrying the heaviest bioweapons a single Tyranid body can mount. One detail SM2 doesn't communicate about the standard Carnifex. If you remove its head, the bioweapon it carries has a smaller secondary brain of its own and will continue engaging targets independently. The weapon doesn't stop when the carrier stops. A decapitated Carnifex is still partially operational. That's the baseline. Two variants SM2 omitted are both escalations from it. The Screamer Killer is a bioplasma-focused Carnifex variant. Warhammer Community's own article on the creature states directly, "The first Screamer Killer got its name from its ability to brew up deadly bioplasma in its guts, which it ejected with a high-pitched screeching noise." The Lexicanum entry confirms the etymology, a Carnifex strain named for the terrifying, ululating shriek that accompanies the plasma discharge. The sound precedes the weapon's arrival by a fraction of a second. The scream is the warning that the plasma is already outbound, timed so that by the time the noise registers as threat information in a human brain, the structural damage is complete. The name is diagnostic. The Tyranid Swarm's design philosophy chose a designation that describes the weapon's delivery method with mechanical precision. It screams, then it kills. The name is a job description. Then there's Old One-Eye. Old One-Eye is one of perhaps 3 named individual Tyranid characters in the entire lore. The others include the Red Terror from the Ravener section and the Doom of Malantai from the Zoanthropes section. Most Tyranid bioforms are interchangeable instances of a type, not individuals. Old One-Eye has a documented individual history, which in the context of a faction that functionally doesn't produce individuals means the creature's record warranted separate entry in the lore. It started as a standard Carnifex, a gigantic siege monster deployed to break fortifications and armored vehicles. What distinguishes Old One-Eye from every other Carnifex in the strain is a regenerative capability that exceeds standard Carnifex healing by a margin sufficient to return the creature from apparently fatal wounds. The Lexicanum documents it. Old One-Eye bears the scars of many blows that should have killed it, and the regeneration has allowed it to return from what should have been death more than once. The Codex places it at the spearhead of Hive Fleet Behemoth's assault on Calth, a world in ultramarine space. Behemoth was the Hive Fleet that launched the assault on Macragge, one of the foundational military engagements in 40K's history, and Old One-Eye was Behemoth's siege instrument on the neighboring approach. The eye it's named for is still gone. The regeneration didn't restore it. Whatever struck Old One-Eye hard enough to destroy that eye left a permanent scar that every subsequent cellular reconstruction has maintained. Everything else healed. Old One-Eye came back carrying the wound and went back to breaking fortifications. The name isn't a design oversight. It's a record of what happened and what didn't get fixed. Hive Fleet Leviathan, the fleet in Space Marine 2, came after Behemoth chronologically. If Behemoth deployed something like Old One-Eye, the question of what Leviathan has developed across its equivalent operational history is one the Mechanicus xenobiologists haven't finished answering. Personality hook for Old One-Eye. It died. It came back scarred. The most terrifying sentence about Old One-Eye is the shortest one. It got up. Everything in this video so far. Warriors shepherding billions of gaunts. Lictors arriving before the fleet and extracting intelligence from every skull they access. Zoanthropes channeling warp energy through craniums built at the cost of every other biological function. Raveners detonating from underground in coordinated packs. Carnifexes with secondary brains mounted in their weapons. All of that is the hive mind operating at standard operational capacity. That is the swarm doing what it was designed to do. The Swarmlord is what happens when the hive mind decides to give a specific engagement its direct personal attention. The Warhammer 40k wiki describes the Swarmlord as the most powerful synapse creature ever created by the hive mind. The apex expression of the hive tyrant strain, elevated beyond standard hive tyrant parameters in every measurable category. 4 bone swords, psychic capability exceeding the already substantial psychic capacity of a standard hive tyrant. Strategic intelligence accumulated across potentially every significant engagement the swarm has fought across its operational history. Where a hive tyrant is a powerful psychic field commander managing the operational picture of a single planetary assault, the Swarmlord is the hive mind's direct intervention in a specific conflict. The swarm doesn't deploy the Swarmlord when it expects to win easily. It deploys the Swarmlord when it wants certainty. When the Swarmlord is killed, and it can be killed, this is documented, the hive mind recollects its consciousness and rebuilds it. This wasn't a replacement entity constructed on the same body plan. The same individual was reconstituted, with accumulated strategic knowledge from every engagement it had ever fought carried forward intact. Marneus Calgar of the Ultramarines has a documented engagement against the Swarmlord, Leviathan, the same fleet operating in Space Marine 2's theater. The hive mind rebuilt it. The rebuilt Swarmlord returned carrying the accumulated knowledge of that encounter, knowing exactly how Calgar fought that engagement, and what sequence of decisions had produced that specific outcome. The strategic implication is measurable and specific. Every time the Swarmlord is defeated, it returns having analyzed the defeat in full. Every chapter master who engages it contributes to its understanding of chapter master tier tactics. The documented engagements with chapter master level opponents across multiple campaigns represent not just battles, but data collection events at the highest tier of military capability, the Imperium fields. The Swarmlord learns from clashing with the best fighters the Imperium can produce, and applies that learning to the next deployment with the same consciousness that experienced the loss. The creatures in Space Marine 2 include Tyranid Warriors, the game treated as common opponents, Lictors as boss encounters you executed with your hands, Zoanthropes as regular ranged enemies you complained about until they were nerfed, and Carnifexes as heavy targets requiring coordinated fire. The Hive Fleet Leviathan you fought in SM2 is a splinter tendril, a fraction of the larger fleet, redirected to the Residius system, operating without the full strategic apparatus of the main fleet. The Swarmlord wasn't deployed to your engagement. Old One-Eye wasn't there. The Screamer Killer wasn't in the roster. The game sent you mid-tier officers, precision vanguard scouts, psychic artillery platforms, underground shock troops, and siege organisms. The full swarm contains a creature that can't be permanently killed and learns from every death. A named Carnifex that has returned from fatal wounds multiple times. A bioplasma variant that announces its approach with a sound designed to arrive after the damage. And at the top of the structure, the hive mind's direct attention given physical form. You played the sampler platter, you survived it. The full buffet is what the lore documents, built by a swarm that has been consuming worlds since before the Imperium existed, incorporating biological data from every species it has encountered, including, apparently, the Eldari, into increasingly refined bioforms. Over 212 documented warrior variants aren't the product of random mutation. They are the product of the hive mind encountering 212 distinct tactical problems and engineering a specific solution to each one. Hive Fleet Leviathan is still active in the lore. The battle against the Swarmlord happened. It was rebuilt. Every engagement the swarm fights, every world it strips, every Space Marine squad that kills a Lictor in a campaign mission, All of that becomes data. The swarm adapts. That's not atmospheric flavor text. That's what 212 warrior variants means in practice. Subscribe if you want more of this.